President, I move to proceed to calendar number 168, H.R. 5371.
Clerk will report.
Motion to proceed to calendar 168, H.R. 5371, an act making continuing appropriations and extensions for fiscal year 2026 and for other purposes.
Mr. President, yesterday we finally heard Democrats entertain the notion of reopening the government. It only took them 38 days. Why, in the days before, progressives were urging Democrats to prolong the shutdown in perpetuity? One House Democrat said, and I quote, "There would be hell to pay if Senate Democrats don't let events play out," end quote. And so I'm glad to see Democrats, after 38 days, back down from the maximalist and frankly insane position they've held since September. The Democrat leader's proposal is a non-starter for the Republican majority. The Democrat leader wants to believe that this is a, quote, simple proposal, that it is some sort of compromise, but it is not.
Hey everyone, welcome back to 45th Perspective. Today, we're diving deep into a Senate floor speech that's been making waves. A heated debate over government funding, healthcare subsidies, and the political blame game that's been unfolding in Washington. Now, before we jump into the details, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our weekly deep dives into American politics and power. And if you really want to support thoughtful, independent analysis like this, you can become a patron at patreon.com/45thperspective for as little as $5 a month. It really helps us keep this channel going and allows us to keep doing this kind of long-form content without relying on corporate sponsors or political interests.
He's talking about throwing tens of billions more taxpayer dollars at a program that even Democrats admit has failed to lower health care costs. The American people are tired of Washington taking their hard-earned money and spending it on costly government programs that fail to follow through on their promises. Of course, that's what Democrats have been doing for years with Obamacare. They passed Obamacare 15 years ago without a single Republican vote. And in that time, Democrats' signature health care law has failed to do what Democrats promised. If you like your health insurance, you can keep it. Not true. If you like your doctor, you can keep him or her. Not true. Premium costs will go down. Not true. And actually, the opposite is true. They keep going up. Obamacare drove premium prices higher. So in 2021, in the Democrats' American Rescue Plan Act, a bill best known for setting off a years-long inflation crisis, Democrats created these Biden bonuses, further papering over the higher premium costs under Obamacare with bigger taxpayer subsidies. Again, they did that without a single Republican vote. And then in another partisan bill in 2022, they extended the subsidies through the end of this year. Democrats chose the expiration date. They created this cliff. And now they want to blame Republicans for their mess. Give me a break, Mr. President. Republicans are not about to further burden taxpayers by blindly extending a flawed program. The Democrats' proposal is just more of the same, masking rising premiums and padding insurance companies' profits with more taxpayer dollars. The Democrat leader's proposal is a non-starter. There's still only one path out. It's a clean funding extension. The House has already passed a clean funding extension. The President supports one and would sign it into law immediately. We're only a handful of votes away from passing one right here in the Senate, Mr. President, a bill that has been sitting at the desk now for 38 days. We reopen, and then we can start talking about addressing the health care mess that Democrats created. Mr. President, I know that Democrats know this. Just yesterday, the Democrat whip came to the floor to say something that I've been waiting for a Democrat to say for a long time. He said that the first thing we need to do is reopen the government, then address the cost of health care and advance appropriations bills. I've been saying that for about 6 weeks now. And I think that's exactly what we need to do today. And so I hope the Democrat whip and others in his caucus will join the 3 Democrats who have been supporting a clean continuing resolution, the only bill that can actually end the shutdown. Mr. President, I'm glad to see that after 38 days, Democrats are finally warming up to the idea that their shutdown can't go on forever. And I urge my colleagues to support a clean continuing resolution so we can start a real discussion to address their health care mess, get back to the regular appropriations process, and above all, finally provide relief to the American people. Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
He's talking about throwing 10...
All right, let's get into it. So, the Senate was back in session this week, and the topic was the ongoing government shutdown, one that's lasted 38 days. That's more than a month of political deadlock, federal workers missing paychecks, stalled services, and mounting frustration across the country. The issue on the table was whether or not to proceed with House Resolution 5371, a bill meant to provide continuing appropriations for the 2026 fiscal year. In plain English, that means keeping the government funded while lawmakers continue to argue over the long-term budget. It's what's known as a continuing resolution, or CR. These kinds of bills are often used as temporary stopgaps to prevent shutdowns. But what makes this debate interesting is not just the procedural side of it. It's the way both parties are framing the issue. On one hand, we have Republicans arguing for what they call a clean, continuing resolution, a simple funding extension without any extra policy riders or spending programs attached. On the other hand, Democrats are pushing for an extension that includes additional funding to maintain certain healthcare subsidies. Specifically, the Affordable Care Act subsidies expanded under the Biden administration. The exchange we're analyzing today features a Republican senator who took to the floor to denounce what he called a non-starter proposal from the Democratic leadership. He accused Democrats of trying to pour billions of taxpayer dollars into a healthcare system that, in his view, has failed to lower costs for ordinary Americans. And that's really where the heart of this debate lies. It's not just about keeping the government open. It's about whether the government should keep propping up Obamacare subsidies, or whether that's throwing good money after bad. The senator starts by expressing what's been a recurring Republican frustration, that Democrats took 38 days to entertain the notion of reopening the government. He points out that some progressive voices were actively encouraging their party to hold out, to keep the shutdown going as a form of political leverage. He even quotes a House Democrat warning that there would be hell to pay if Senate Democrats stepped in too soon. Now, whether you see that as principled resistance or reckless political posturing depends on where you stand. Progressives often argue that government shutdowns, while painful, can be used to force bigger conversations about national priorities, for example, protecting healthcare coverage or climate spending. Conservatives, on the other hand, tend to see prolonged shutdowns as evidence of dysfunction and irresponsible governance. In this case, the senator clearly falls in the second camp. He frames Democrats' behavior as not only politically motivated but also economically harmful, especially after more than a month of stalled operations. Then he moves into his critique of healthcare spending. He argues that Democrats' proposal isn't a compromise, despite how it's being presented. Instead, he calls it tens of billions more taxpayer dollars for a program that hasn't achieved what it promised, namely affordable healthcare. Here's where the political and ideological divide becomes most visible. Republicans have long opposed the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, since its passage in 2010. Their argument is that it's driven up premiums, reduced choice, and created government dependency in the private insurance market. Democrats, conversely, maintain that the ACA expanded access to coverage and provided crucial protections for people with pre-existing conditions. So, when Republicans describe these ongoing subsidies as Biden bonuses, essentially taxpayer-funded payouts that cover up the underlying inflation in healthcare costs, they're not just making a fiscal argument. They're making a philosophical one about the role of government. Let's pause for a second and put this in context. Back in 2021, during the height of the pandemic, Democrats passed the American Rescue Plan, a $1.9 trillion package that included temporary increases in healthcare subsidies under the ACA. The idea was to make health insurance more affordable during a period of economic uncertainty. Then, in 2022, they extended those subsidies again through another partisan bill without Republican votes. But those extensions were temporary, and they're now set to expire. That's what this current debate is about, whether to extend those subsidies again. Democrats argue that if Congress doesn't act, millions of Americans could see their premiums spike dramatically, effectively pricing many families out of coverage. They say the extension is necessary to prevent a healthcare cliff. Republicans respond that Democrats set this expiration date themselves. They knew the subsidies were temporary, and are now trying to blame Republicans for the consequences of their own design. They say it's not responsible to keep bailing out a flawed system year after year with borrowed money. So when the senator says, "Give me a break," he's expressing what a lot of fiscal conservatives feel, that Democrats are refusing to confront the structural problems in the healthcare system, instead using taxpayer subsidies as a band-aid solution. He also makes the case that these subsidies don't just help consumers. They also pad insurance companies' profits. That's a point worth pausing on, because it's true that government subsidies can indirectly boost private sector revenue. If the government pays a larger share of your premium, the insurer still gets the same or even more money. You just see less of it coming out of your own pocket. So from a Republican perspective, the issue isn't just that it's expensive. It's that the policy may be propping up corporate profits in the name of public good, something that's supposed to be the opposite of what progressives want. Now, stepping back for a moment, there's a broader philosophical question here. Should healthcare be treated as a commodity or as a right? Because depending on how you answer that, your policy preferences change dramatically. If you see healthcare as a commodity, something you purchase and consume, then it makes sense to argue for market competition, less government interference, and individual responsibility. But if you see healthcare as a human right, something that should be universally guaranteed, then you're more likely to support subsidies, regulations, and public spending to make that a reality. That's why this debate keeps coming up. It's not just about dollars and cents. It's about what kind of society we want to be. Now, getting back to the Senate floor, the senator says the Democrats' plan is a non-starter and insists there's only one real way out of the shutdown: a clean continuing resolution. In other words, reopen the government first, then argue about healthcare later. And interestingly, he points out that even some Democrats have started to agree with that sequence. According to him, the Democratic whip recently acknowledged that reopening the government should come first, before tackling healthcare costs or appropriations. That's a notable shift because it signals growing fatigue within the Democratic caucus over how long this standoff has lasted. Some moderates are probably worried about the optics of an extended shutdown, especially with an election year approaching. The senator also emphasizes that the House has already passed a clean resolution, the president would sign it, and the votes are supposedly just a few short of what's needed in the Senate. So from his standpoint, the solution is straightforward. Stop playing politics, pass the clean bill, reopen the government, and then get back to negotiating policy differences in a normal legislative process. Now, let's take a step back and analyze both sides fairly. From the Democratic point of view, the inclusion of the healthcare subsidies isn't just political, it's practical. If those subsidies expire, millions of Americans could suddenly face higher premiums or lose coverage entirely. Democrats argue that it's irresponsible to reopen the government without addressing an issue that could cause immediate harm to people's lives. To them, a continuing resolution that doesn't protect healthcare access is like patching a leak in one part of the boat while ignoring a gaping hole in another. But from the Republican side, adding policy riders to a funding bill, especially one meant to end a shutdown, is seen as bad faith bargaining. They argue that continuing resolutions should be clean, limited in scope, and not used as vehicles for unrelated policy priorities. They also have a long-term concern. If Democrats keep attaching spending expansions to routine funding bills, it becomes almost impossible to rein in the national debt or evaluate programs on their actual effectiveness. That's a valid point, too. Washington's budgeting process has become so gridlocked that major policies are often pushed through as part of must-pass legislation. And when that happens, accountability gets blurred. Now, let's talk about the political optics. Government shutdowns are rarely good for anyone, politically or practically. Historically, the party perceived as obstructing the reopening of government tends to take the blame. But in this case, both sides are trying hard to frame the narrative in their favor. Republicans are saying, "We've been ready to reopen for weeks." Democrats are holding this up to protect a failed healthcare policy. Democrats are saying, "We're trying to protect families' access to affordable coverage," and Republicans are the ones willing to hurt ordinary Americans by refusing to fund it. And if you're an average citizen watching all this, you might just be thinking, why can't they do both? Why can't they reopen the government and figure out healthcare at the same time? The reality is, Washington doesn't usually work that way. These shutdowns happen precisely because both sides see leverage in the crisis. Democrats see a chance to push for policy concessions. Republicans see a chance to demand fiscal restraint. Meanwhile, regular people, small business owners, federal workers, families waiting for tax refunds, are the ones paying the price. Let's think about what's at stake for them. When the government shuts down, it's not just an abstract political event. It affects everything from airport security and food inspections to veterans' benefits and loan processing. Federal workers can go weeks without pay, and contractors, who don't get back pay, may never recover those lost wages. So even though the debate might sound like it's about healthcare subsidies, the ripple effects are much larger. It's about how long Americans are expected to live with uncertainty while politicians fight over who gets the last word. That's why the senator's emphasis on reopening first, then negotiating, resonates with some voters. It represents a kind of let's get the house in order before redecorating argument. But it's also fair to note that reopening without addressing key issues could just kick the can down the road again, setting up the next shutdown fight a few months later. And that's where a more structural question comes in. Why does this keep happening? Part of the answer is polarization. Congress used to be able to pass appropriations bills on time through bipartisan committees. But over the past 2 decades, budget fights have become symbolic battlegrounds for bigger ideological wars, healthcare, immigration, energy, you name it. The shutdown becomes the stage for each side to prove their point to their base. Now, personally, when I look at this situation, I see both political calculation and genuine conviction. I think many Democrats sincerely believe healthcare access is too important to risk. But I also think some of them see political advantage in framing Republicans as cold or indifferent. Likewise, I think many Republicans genuinely believe in fiscal responsibility and the dangers of endless spending. But I also think they see an opportunity to paint Democrats as reckless spenders, which plays well with their voters. So, when you strip away the rhetoric, what we're really watching is not just a policy debate, it's a struggle over moral framing. Each side wants to own the narrative of who's protecting the American people. Are you protecting them from higher taxes and inflation? Or are you protecting them from losing healthcare coverage? Both arguments appeal to a sense of fairness, they just start from different premises. And that's what makes this so difficult. When the senator calls for a clean, continuing resolution, he's not wrong to want the government reopened. The country shouldn't have to endure nearly 40 days of shutdown just to move the conversation forward. But Democrats aren't necessarily wrong to say that we can't ignore the healthcare cliff looming in front of millions of families either. The truth, as usual, is somewhere in between. If there's a compromise to be had, it might look like this: pass the clean resolution now, reopen the government immediately, and then attach a firm commitment, maybe even a short deadline, to negotiate healthcare policy separately. That way, people can get back to work, services can resume, and both sides can still fight their fight. Just not at the expense of the entire country. That kind of middle ground isn't flashy. It doesn't satisfy the political extremes. But it's the kind of practical leadership that most Americans say they want to see. Unfortunately, moderation doesn't trend on social media. Outrage does. And that's part of why shutdowns drag on, because the incentives for political performance are stronger than the incentives for practical governance. Still, moments like this, when the Senate is forced to confront the consequences of inaction, can sometimes create unexpected openings. For example, The senator mentioned that 3 Democrats have already expressed support for a clean continuing resolution. That might not sound like a lot, but in a closely divided Senate, a handful of defections can change the outcome. If more moderates on both sides step up, this could break sooner than expected. And when it does, the next battle over healthcare funding will probably be just as fierce. Because let's be honest, the healthcare debate isn't going away. The U.S. spends more per capita on healthcare than any other developed nation, yet millions still struggle to afford coverage or medical care. That's a paradox both parties are failing to solve. Republicans focus on reducing costs by promoting competition and cutting bureaucracy. Democrats focus on expanding access through subsidies and regulation. Both have valid points, but neither approach alone has fixed the problem. If anything, this debate shows how deeply intertwined fiscal policy, healthcare, and political ideology have become. And until there's a shared vision for how to balance those priorities, every new funding cycle risks becoming another standoff. So what's the takeaway here? For me, it's this: government shutdowns are not signs of strength. They're symptoms of a broken process. And while both sides can score political points in the short term, the long-term cost is public trust. People want to see leaders who can argue passionately but still compromise. They want to see lawmakers who can disagree without turning governance into hostage-taking. And they want to believe that someone in Washington is actually thinking about how these debates affect their daily lives, their jobs, their bills, their healthcare. So, whether you lean conservative or liberal, it's worth asking, what's the line between holding your principles and holding the country hostage? That's a tough question, and one that every voter will need to think about as we head into another election year. If nothing else, this Senate debate reminds us that policy decisions aren't made in a vacuum. They ripple outward into families, businesses, and communities. The shutdown may be a political story in D.C., but for millions of Americans, it's a very real disruption. And that's why it matters who blinks first. Thanks for watching this deep dive on 45th Perspective. If you found this breakdown helpful or thought-provoking, please give this video a like. It really helps with the YouTube algorithm. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/45th Perspective. Your support helps us keep creating independent, in-depth political analysis that doesn't just chase headlines, but actually tries to make sense of them. And now, I'd love to hear from you. Do you think the government should reopen immediately with a clean resolution? Or should Democrats hold out to protect healthcare subsidies? Let's talk about it in the comments below, respectfully. Let's keep this space one for real discussion, not just partisan shouting. I'm your host, and this has been 45th Perspective. See you in the next video.